Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's edition to the Canadian Tree Fund webinar series, which aims to bring relevant topics in arboriculture and urban forestry to Canadian arborists. Today's presentation is Speaking for the Trees, Homeowner Preferences and Decision-Making on Residential Properties. Our presenter is Kaitlyn Pike. Kaitlyn is a PhD student exploring urban forest governance and green equity at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Kaitlyn's research interests revolve around people's values and perceptions of green spaces and how to best protect, manage, and advocate for trees in an increasingly urbanized world. The Canadian Tree Fund extends a big thank you to Kaitlyn for joining us here today, and we'll turn it over to her as she presents. Thanks, Kaitlyn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. As Alex introduced, my name is Kaitlyn, and I'm a PhD student in the Urban Natures Lab at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. So today I will be talking about tree preservation on residential properties, first from the perspective of municipal ordinances, and then followed by discussion of homeowners' knowledge, perceptions, and practices. So to give a quick outline of my presentation, I will briefly discuss the literature regarding urban development and its impacts on trees, followed by an introduction of the study site. Next, I will summarize the findings of my master's research, which was an evaluation of a residential tree preservation ordinance in a Midwestern city in the United States. This will be followed by the main topic of today's presentation, which is a follow-up survey of homeowner knowledge, practices, and perceptions of the trees and natural areas on their residential properties. And then finally, I will discuss the implications of this research. So first, a little background to get us oriented. In the United States, urban forests represent 35% of all urban land cover. They deliver benefits to 2/3 of the population. They provide significant ecosystem services, and they produce over $18 billion in net annual benefit. However, rising urban population and development threatens the diversity and extent of urban trees, which not only lowers ecosystem service benefits, but can actually cause ecosystem disservices such as damage to human health and property. Furthermore, development and urbanization is accelerating, which threatens existing and future canopy cover. Regarding urban development, a review of the literature found that when no tree preservation ordinance is in place, development can lead to tree loss and a decline in canopy cover. Survival decreases as proximity to development increases, particularly for more mature trees. Challenges often occur from root severance and soil compaction. And finally, species differ in their tolerance to construction disturbance. The two studies that we'll be talking about today took place in the city of Highland Park, which is an affluent suburban city about 25 miles north of Chicago in the Midwestern United States. This is a city of 30,000 residents and nearly 50% canopy cover. Highland Park employs a city forester, an assistant city forester, and a forestry intern with the combined task of managing 30,000 public trees, as well as oversight on tree removal and protection permits as they relate to private trees on private properties. Because of the city forester's background in academia, which includes a doctorate in forestry, he also created my temporary position with some extra available funding. So speaking of funding, it's worth noting that Highland Park has an above average budget in terms of forestry departments. It hovers around $1 million annually, and this is 3 times the US national average for forestry departments of similar population sizes. And here on the right is an aerial photo of the city of Highland Park. Highland Park is also significant for its contributions to pop culture. It was the filming location for several John Hughes classics such as Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Weird Science, 16 Candles, and Home Alone. It's also been home to celebrities such as Michael Jordan, whose gates you can see here, Mr. T, and the lead singer of the Smashing Pumpkins. And then Highland Park was also home to landscape architect Jens Jensen and has a building designed by architect Frank Lloyd Wright on its registry of historic places. So over the years, Highland Park has passed several tree preservation ordinances that are considered models for tree protection on public and private properties. These ordinances classify all trees over 8 inches in diameter as protected, key, or heritage trees based on species and size. Even on private property, none of these classified trees may be removed without approval from the City Council and the Neighborhood Tree Council, as well as the Forestry Department. Trees with heritage status are the most protected species, and receiving a permit for their removal is incredibly difficult. So anytime a developer wants to construct or redevelop a building in Highland Park, they must receive a building permit. To receive approval, developers must hire a certified arborist to conduct a pre-construction inventory and create a tree preservation plan that indicates where each tree is on site, as well as the respective tree protection zones around each tree or group of trees. So here is an example of how trees are classified by city ordinance. As I mentioned, all trees over 8 inches in diameter or 20 centimeters in diameter, except buckthorn and willow, are classified as key species, which means a permit is needed for their removal at any point. If they are to be removed, they must be replaced with 2 trees for each tree removed. And if removed unlawfully, a $1,000 fine is issued for each tree. And then classification status increases with size and species. So here is the heritage species. They're very unlikely to be removed through a permit, but must be replaced with 4 trees if granted permission. And then if removed unlawfully, homeowners or developers can be fined $4,000 for each instance of removal. So with this context in mind, we set out with the following research aims. So we wanted to better understand the efficacy of the tree preservation ordinance in the city. And then afterwards, we wanted to better understand the knowledge, perceptions, and practices of homeowners regarding the trees and natural areas on their property. Okay, now I will briefly tell you about my first study, which was an evaluation of Highland Park's tree preservation ordinance. As I mentioned, this was a part of my master's thesis, and I designed this research project that would assess the condition and mortality of trees on properties that had experienced residential redevelopment, that is infill construction, where pre-existing homes were demolished and brand new homes were built in their place. So for the sake of time, I'll move pretty quickly through this study and through the methods, but I did want to highlight the methods. So this initial study began with a plan and permit analysis that involved finding residential homes that met certain requirements of having been completely demolished and redeveloped between the years 2004 and 2015. I used physical case files to find tree preservation plans that allowed me to determine which trees were meant to be preserved on properties, which I will show you in the following slide. Also able to use the permit numbers to notify homeowners that we would be surveying their trees and that they could opt out by contacting the Forestry Department. Properties that had not experienced any recent construction were used as our control or comparison properties. And here's an example of a construction site map with a tree preservation plan that I determined to be viable. As you can see here, this is where the new home is proposed to be built. And then these are the trees that were approved for removal here with the X's. So if we zoom in, here you can see an example of how each tree was measured for its DBH. And then this is the tree protection zone that is clearly marked with the X's and dashed lines. So having the trees that were intended to be removed and the trees intended to be preserved clearly marked like this on these maps allowed me to calculate an overall tree preservation rate for each property by tallying how many preserved trees were still remaining in the years after construction occurred. So when I was finally ready to go into the field, this is an example of the inventory protocol I used. I measured each tree within 100 feet or 30 meters of the house foundation and gave it a unique number. The tree preservation site plan I just discussed was then used to record whether the tree was preserved or had been removed after construction took place. If the tree was still there, I recorded its genus and species, size, condition, proximity to hardscape, level of soil compaction, and soil moisture. If the tree was removed, I still proceeded with measuring proximity to hardscape, soil compaction, and soil moisture because I was also interested in whether these factors played a role in tree mortality or removal following construction. For tree condition, I used both the traditional method that the city used, such as good, fair, poor, but also I made use of an index that included a crown and trunk assessment. I also measured proximity to various types of hardscape with a digital hypsometer, and then I used a digital pentrometer and sensor to measure soil compaction and soil moisture. So a quick overview of the results. We found that the city's ordinance was successful in preserving trees during and after construction occurred. This was evident through an overall preservation rate of nearly 75%, tree condition ratings that were comparable to trees on properties that had not experienced any recent construction, having found no correlation between proximity to newly developed foundation and observed tree condition or mortality, and the discovery of healthy soil compaction levels within tree protection areas and the critical root zones of preserved trees. So these findings align with recent studies that consider the outcomes of tree ordinances on tree health, where tree ordinances were found to increase urban canopy cover and protect street trees during construction. So I definitely breezed through this study for the sake of time and so that we can talk about the second study a bit more. But if you'd like more details about the methods or a more thorough discussion of the results, you can find all that in the published version of this research. So please feel free to email me if you would like a copy. Okay, so now I will tell you about the follow-up research that I completed, which involved the analysis of residential surveys, which were distributed to the same homeowners in the first study. In order to get a better understanding of the knowledge, practices, and perceptions of homeowners involved in a first study, we designed a set of surveys that were adapted from previous survey research, which asked similar questions, but in a city without a tree preservation ordinance. In this second study that I'm talking about now, we surveyed the same group of homeowners from study one, where study homeowners were those that owned these newly constructed homes, and then the comparison homeowners were those that owned the older homes that had not received any major renovations since first being built several decades ago. So for this presentation, study homeowners will be highlighted in indigo, and then the comparison homeowners will be highlighted in teal. For this research, we followed the Dillman method, which involved sending homeowners a notice, a letter with a survey, a postcard, and a final letter with a survey, all through the US Postal Service, and all staggered about 2 weeks apart. They were also given the option to reply online. Our questions were focused on demographics, planting and removal, maintenance and landscaping, preferences and decision-making, relationships with landscaping, tree care, and forestry professionals, and environmental attitudes regarding the enjoyment of nature and the altering of nature for human benefit. And these surveys were sent to the 147 homeowners who participated in the original study. And our survey data was analyzed using cross-tabulation and chi-square. So here are the front pages of both homeowner surveys. On the left is the survey distributed to study homeowners, and on the right is the survey that was distributed to comparison homeowners. I think they were both about like 4 pages long. As you can see, we put my previous university's logo big and bold on the front of each of these surveys as an extra way to build rapport with homeowners. And here is an example of some older homes that may have been included in both studies and represent the comparison group. Again, these are older homes that had not experienced any recent redevelopment since initially being constructed in the middle of the previous century up until about the 1970s. On the other hand, these are some examples of new homes in the city of Highland Park that have been built in the past 2 decades. The homes that were shown previously, the comparison homes, are thus often being demolished and replaced with these. And in part, this may be the reason why the city is losing some of its trees when these new buildings are built. So this group represents our study homeowners. All right, so now we come to the results of study 2. So in total, we received responses from 67 homeowners with a total response rate of 46%. If I remember clearly, we had about the same amount of response online as we did in the physical version of the surveys. And we asked homeowners how long they have lived in Highland Park, how long they have lived at their current homes. And the purpose of these questions were to understand the relationship of the homeowner to their property and to ensure that our homeowners' demographics matched that of our previous study. So we found that study homeowners moved to the city more recently and have lived in their homes for a shorter period of time. Conversely, the comparison homeowners have lived in Highland Park longer and have lived in their older homes for longer. So these findings fit the scope of both of our studies, where study homeowners are the new owners of these brand new homes, whereas the comparison homeowners have owned and lived in their current homes for much longer. In terms of other demographics, we found that study homeowners own properties that are worth nearly double than the comparison group, and with the majority of their household incomes being more than $250,000 a year. While both groups are most likely to work full-time, the comparison group is more likely to be retired. For both groups, education was similar, with the majority having received a bachelor's degree. And then for age, we found that the study group is about a generation younger. So to summarize, the owners of new homes are newer to the city, have higher property values and property incomes, while our comparison group has lived in the city longer and are more likely to be retired. Across both groups, though, we find higher property and income when compared to the US average. So now that we have a better understanding of these two groups, we can start to explore decision-making and preferences at the residential property level. One of the critical parts of the survey was understanding how involved the new study homeowners were in the decision-making process involving trees during the development of their property. So for our study group, nearly 3/4 of homeowners owned the property at the time of redevelopment, which is good because then we know that they were a part of this process. So of these that were a part of the process, only 1/3 reported making any decisions about tree removal on their property. Less than a quarter consulted an arborist, and nearly a third were removed from the process entirely by stating that they did not know. So the residents that were aware of trees being removed reported that small diameter trees were most likely to be removed, though nearly 1/5 reported that mature trees were removed during development. We also wanted to explore their knowledge of whether trees were planted after development occurred. This provides us with clues to how involved or removed these homeowners may have been from the process of tree preservation on their property. For this study group, again, a little over half didn't know whether trees were planted after development took place as per city code, and only 15% recalled whether the trees that were planted lived or died. So as you may recall, per the city's tree preservation ordinance, replacement tree plantings are required for any trees removed during development, but few homeowners were aware if they were required to replant these trees and whether or not these trees had lived or died following replanting. So they were completely removed from the process. Next, we asked both groups of homeowners whether they planted trees after assuming residence. For the owners of new homes, these would be trees planted that were not a requirement of city code, but were instead voluntarily planted on their own accord. So we found that the homeowners who owned older homes were more likely to plant trees, and when they did, more than half planted 5 or more trees since assuming residence. This makes sense given that these residents have lived on these properties for a longer period of time. Next, we asked both groups of homeowners whether they had witnessed the death of mature trees after assuming residence. We found that comparison homeowners in older homes were more likely to report that mature trees had died since assuming residence. Again, this makes sense that homeowners who lived on these properties longer would have more time to witness tree mortality, particularly as it relates to pests and diseases such as emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease. That being said, we found that these differences were not statistically significant, meaning that both groups were statistically just as likely to plant trees and witness tree loss on their properties. When purchasing their current homes, both groups of homeowners agreed that resale value and proximity to schools were the most influential reasons. These represent more practical reasons for deciding to purchase a home in comparison to the other possible options, such as the forest-like nature of the community or the prevalence of trees on the property. When asked what preferences they had for the landscaping on their property, both groups of homeowners agreed that they were more likely to prefer a partially landscaped lot. While there was no statistical significance in the differences between their answers, we do see that study homeowners are more likely to prefer properties that are as landscaped as possible as their second preference, whereas comparison homeowners are more likely to prefer partially natural as their second option. And when asked about their thoughts regarding the number and variety of trees, shrubs, pollinators, and wildlife on their properties, both groups overwhelmingly reported that their properties were adequate regarding most of these categories, though both groups did describe wanting more pollinators, more variety of trees, but less wildlife. When probed a bit more about some of these preferences, we found that comparison homeowners in older homes were statistically more likely to report that they believe native species are important, as well as species that attract pollinators. When asked about their attitudes towards the maintenance of their property, the majority of both study and comparison homeowners did not view the trees and shrubs on their property as a nuisance, with only 16% of homeowners reporting that they did believe some of these trees and shrubs on their properties were a nuisance. For both groups, the majority of respondents maintained their property by making decisions about landscaping broadly. This is followed by their removal of invasive species, maintaining a vegetable garden, providing bird feeders or homes, and incorporating plants for pollinators. Regarding the maintenance of trees on their property, both groups were most likely to prune their trees. We also asked homeowners what activities they were most likely to participate in on their properties. For both groups, The majority listed grilling and outdoors as their most practiced activity, followed by gardening, though we found that comparison homeowners were statistically more likely to list gardening as an important activity. Next, we asked homeowners about their relationships with professionals and experts involved in the maintenance of their properties. So while nearly all residents reported that they made landscaping decisions broadly on their own, a majority of respondents from both groups reported hiring a landscape service, with about half hiring a tree care specialist to care for their trees. We did find that comparison homeowners were more likely to consult with a certified arborist, with nearly half having done so in the last year, that being 2019. On the other hand, the study homeowners in the brand new homes were less likely, particularly in that previous year, to consult with a certified arborist. Both groups, however, were just as likely to speak with the city's forestry section, with nearly half having done so. One of the last things we wanted to understand was the general knowledge that these homeowners have regarding the natural aspects of their properties. We found that the comparison group who owns older homes was statistically more likely to have correct knowledge about the soils on their property, and they were able to identify whether the vegetation on their property was non-native or invasive. Comparison homeowners were also more likely to report observing tree-related pests and diseases on their properties, and were more likely to list seeing specific instances of emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, and oak wilt. The fact that the comparison homeowners are more in tune with the natural aspects of their property also makes sense because, as you may recall, we found that this group was statistically more likely to list gardening as an important hobby that they take part of on their properties. And then finally, to explore the attitudes that surveyed homeowners have regarding the environment, we used the Environmental Attitudes Inventory that was developed by Milfont and Duckett. This inventory was created based on a synthesis of existing literature and proposes a method of measuring environmental attitudes that is based on broad evaluations of perceptions or beliefs regarding the natural environment. So the two scales that we used in our survey were designed to measure survey respondents' perceptions and attitudes towards natural areas. So the first refers to the enjoyment of nature and is defined as the belief that enjoying time in nature is pleasant and preferred to spending time in urban areas, versus the belief that enjoying time in nature is dull, boring, and not enjoyable. So we found that both groups believed enjoying time in nature is pleasant and preferred to spending time in urban areas, and that there was no statistical significance in the differences between the means. The second scale we used refers to the altering of nature, or the belief that humans have the right to change or alter nature and remake the environment as they wish to satisfy human goals and objectives. So when we asked both groups questions regarding the altering of nature for human benefit, we found that new homeowners were more likely to agree with this sentiment, while comparison homeowners were more likely to believe that nature should be preserved, not altered by human activity. So these findings align with our previous results, where we found that both groups seem to appreciate and care for the trees and natural areas on their property. But because study homeowners are the owners of these brand new homes and have more recently altered their property, it is unsurprising that they would lean towards the belief that altering nature and remaking the environment for human goals and objectives is justified. Okay, so let's go through a summary of the results by looking at what we found for study homeowners, comparison homeowners, and what was similar between both groups. For the owners of new homes, our study group, we found that these residents are newer to the city, have higher property values, and higher household incomes. During the redevelopment process, they were a bit removed from the decision-making, allowing developers and other professionals to make major decisions regarding the trees on their properties. Many had little knowledge of whether trees lived or died after construction occurred and lacked knowledge on the natural aspects of their property. These homeowners were also more likely to believe that humans have the right to alter nature. On the other hand, we have our comparison group, the owners of older homes. These residents are older, have lived in the city longer, are more likely to be retirees, and are very likely to be self-described gardeners. They're also more likely to find native species and pollinators important, have more knowledge on the natural aspects of their property, and are more likely to hire an arborist. All of these are statistically significant differences that we have found between these groups. Now, for both groups, this is where we found no statistical significance, meaning both groups were just as likely to list more practical reasons for purchasing their homes, such as resale value and location to schools, prefer partially landscaped lawns, plant trees and witness tree loss, make landscaping decisions including pruning their trees, hire landscaping and tree care professionals to care for their properties, communicate with the city's forestry section, and express an appreciation of nature. So as I mentioned earlier, our study survey was adapted from a previous study by Vander White and Miller in the mid-1980s. So homeowners in their study had recently bought homes on wooded lots in rural Wisconsin where a tree preservation plan was not in place. So to our knowledge, this is the only study of its kind, which is why we based our survey around some of the same questions, though it is hard to make any direct comparisons because of the difference in rural versus suburban, and of course the difference of the 2020s almost and the 1980s. It's still interesting to observe some of the similarities and differences between these studies. So we found that for both the Vander White study and ours, the same rate of homeowners reported small and large diameter trees were removed, meaning regardless of whether there was a preservation ordinance in place, homeowners reported the same likelihood of small and large diameter trees having been removed when their house was being developed. Both groups of homeowners reported that their properties were adequate in terms of the number of trees and shrubs, and both expressed a slight desire for a greater variety of trees. In both our study and the 1980s study, we found that the homeowners of newly built homes lacked sufficient knowledge regarding the natural aspects of their property. For the Vander White study, they went as far as to say that homeowners lacked sufficient knowledge to safeguard the lot environment. In terms of the differences between studies, the 1980s homeowners listed resale as their third most important reason for purchasing the property, behind the presence of trees and the country-like atmosphere. Location to schools was number 7. So if you recall, resale value and the location of schools were the most reported reasons for both groups of homeowners in our study, perhaps showing a shift in the importance that homeowners place on future property values based on the housing market and the quality of good public education. So on the other hand, the 1980s study found that the presence of trees and the country-like atmosphere of the community were the two most important factors when purchasing their home. But this makes sense, as the authors described that during this time period, many people were leaving the city for suburban or rural communities. Vander White and Miller described these factors as being aesthetic values, whereas location of school and resale values were described as functional values. So using the same language as Vander White and Miller use, our homeowners in our study prioritized functional values over aesthetic values when deciding to purchase their homes. And then based on their findings, Vander White and Miller recommended enacting tree preservation ordinances and providing more opportunities for community engagement and education for both homeowners and home developers. So not a lot has changed since. So now let's compare what we found in our study with what existing literature has found. So this is definitely not exhaustive yet, but just a start to the conversation. So first, we find that the location to quality public schools is one of the most influential factors for home buyers, at least in the United States. In a study that analyzed the moves of 4,000 home buyers across metro regions between the years 1998 and 2011, school quality was linked to an increase in home prices within the school's zip code. For the most part, it is understood that people prefer park-like landscapes with broad expanses of trees and grass and trees, though this has also been found to depend on region and culture, such as Western and non-Western experiences. Homeowners tend to prefer tidy landscapes with manicured lawns, which is often seen as a community responsibility. However, this paradigm may be shifting due to an increased interest and understanding of native and pollinator species and water conservation. An online survey by the National Association of Landscape Professionals found that 40% of Americans with lawns hired a lawn care professional, and 51% of those individuals hire tree care professionals. Studies have found that people like trees and tend to have favorable attitudes towards tree ordinances. However, in some states, Florida and the United States, for example, private tree ordinances are vulnerable to regulation that limits the oversight and power of local government to protect trees during development. So this provides yet another example of why it is important to work with and include community stakeholders in the decision-making surrounding trees. Ordinances are not the only solution, particularly if there are state regulations that look to remove them and limit their effectiveness. So we therefore need a holistic approach that includes all aspects of recognition and participation in the protection and advocacy of city and community trees. And then critically, studies continue to find that homeowners lack knowledge regarding the natural areas of their properties, with private residential land representing a significant portion of total land use. Homeowner engagement and education remains an important component of resilient communities for both trees and people. So what do the results tell us about the role of tree preservation and resiliency in our communities and urban forests? So we found that homeowners in our study appreciated nature and the natural areas on their property, but similar to other studies, they lean towards valuing aesthetic benefits and may be swayed by cultural norms, such as the pressure to have manicured lawns and turf grass over more natural landscapes. Furthermore, the stated preferences that homeowners report may conflict with what they practice. For example, while both sets of homeowners desired more pollinators on their properties, only a few reported that they intentionally planted species that attracted pollinators. According to the residents of recently developed homes, many were removed from the decision-making process, and many relied on professionals and experts when making landscaping decisions. For this reason, it is important to establish ordinances that follow best management practices and science to guide communities in how to better protect and grow the urban forest. The fact that the majority of homeowners in the study rely on experts and have some sort of relationship with the city's forestry section speaks volumes and provides incredible opportunities for engagement. Furthermore, this provides opportunities for all parties to be involved in the decision-making regarding the trees in their neighborhood, which leads to more engaged and resilient communities. So that being said, and as a result of this research, we recommend that cities continue introducing and updating their urban forestry management plans. For cities that have yet to do so, there's a plethora of resources to be found through ISA's BMPs and local chapters. It is also important to introduce ordinances that protect both public and private trees. As we've learned here, ordinances are critical because they uphold science and practitioner-based best management practices, regardless of the knowledge or attitudes of homeowners or developers. So once these types of things are established, assessing the effectiveness of policies and programs can be a way to explore what is working and what isn't, such as what we've seen today in these two studies. Furthermore, these types of projects are great ways to collaborate with universities, nonprofits, and homeowners, again, as was done in these two studies I described today. And finally, let's continue engaging with communities. Every one of us have unique perspectives and qualities that add value to the decision-making surrounding trees and green spaces in our communities. Whether formally or informally, trees have such an amazing power to bring people together and build communities. So let us continue to focus on what brings us all together, and in doing so, make our communities more green, more livable, and more resilient in the process. And then finally, what are some areas for future research? Personally, I'm interested in community knowledge and perceptions regarding the benefits that urban trees provide, the level of community support for tree ordinances, and the policy and programs that grow and protect the urban forest. Who's involved in introducing these policies, and how is this policy shaped? What are the outcomes of these types of policies on things like canopy cover, but also public perception and support? And finally, how can we make urban forest governance more equitable? So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Please feel free to ask me any questions you may have. You can also follow up by email. This research is currently in preparation and will also be published alongside another study where we surveyed the home developers regarding their knowledge and practices surrounding tree preservation during development in the same city. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kaitlyn. Anyone who's attended today, feel free to put your questions in the question box, and we'll answer them as we go through. While you're doing that and posting your questions in the chat, you talked about the ISA's resources, Kaitlyn. Could you touch on kind of how you see those being applicable kind of throughout Canada, the United States, or do people kind of have to do their own legwork, if you will, to make sure that it's applicable to the environment that they're working in, or is it more of a turnkey type setup for tree protection ordinances?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would definitely have to prepare myself a bit more to be able to answer that question fully. But I know personally, just from going through different resources when I was like working on my master's, etc. Of course, like the ISA has and like ANSI puts out a bunch of those different books on tree preservation during development and the different like best management practices. But it doesn't really, I feel like you kind of do have to piece together things in order to best serve you. Of course, like Trees in Development is a book that gets cited very often by Clark and Matheny. And then there's like local nonprofits kind of can piece together how to set up ordinances. There's always like webinars and presentations where people are kind of like sharing their perspective of how they put together their forestry plan or their ordinance. So I don't know if there's exactly like one exact place that you can go to get everything. You might know more than I do because I know that you're very familiar with like the ISA and their resources. And it's also, it had been a while since I've looked recently, and I know there's like even just at ISA this past month, earlier in December, a lot of the presentations were focused on tree preservation ordinances. So I feel like more and more resources are becoming available. So yeah, I know there's things out there, but I don't have the exact answer for sure.
Terrific, thank you. There's another chat question here, which is, would you be able to expand on trends in the United States where tree ordinances may be in jeopardy? You mentioned Florida. If you could expand on that.
Yeah. So I know I'd have to look. I mean, Florida is just like the key case that I know about because the paper, the Kozer paper, which I think came out in 2020, really highlighted that. And I'm actually not like too much of an expert, but let me find it quick and I can share it in the chat. I just know that, so in the context of like the United States, and depending on the state, of course. Okay, so even when I highlighted, talking about the comparison to the literature, for example, there's a lot of nuances that go into, people. So there's a paper by Tenley Conway. I forget what year. I know I need to like write all this stuff down so I can share it with you all. So, but she found that, people are favorable of ordinances, but there's like some nuances behind that, like to a point, especially in the United States, people don't like to really be told what to do on their own properties. And so especially if you're having this government kind of come in, kind of top down and telling people what to do on their own properties without them even fully understanding the significance, then you're going to get a lot of pushback. So, Florida being an example, but I can imagine in other states where, private property laws are really like a heated issue, that you could get pushback if you don't have kind of community buy-in into these types of ordinances. And so I think that's kind of what the Florida example is kind of writing on. And I'd have to look back into it because it had been a while since I had looked at it. But, from my understanding, of course, too, is that when you do have these ordinances that protect trees, that, that can slow down business and development and some of the things that other, interests who, don't really care about trees necessarily, it kind of slows down what they're doing. But let me see if I can find this paper quick and I could share it with you all. And feel free to ask me any other questions while I look.
Another question then on the topic, kind of putting ordinances in place. If you're putting these ordinances in and you're public about kind of their upcoming installation into a municipality, is there a risk then that people are, prioritizing their construction or prioritizing like tree removals in the interim between that announcement and the implementation of the actual bylaw?
You mean like trying to remove trees ahead of time, sort of
That's
thing?
right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, probably. Yeah. I guess, yeah, it depends. I mean, I would imagine so. But yeah, like this is something that I would like to look into more. I mean, I kind of have this like one understanding of this city. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more to learn and understand. I did find this one paper. So the paper, let's see, wait. Oh, sorry. It led me astray. Okay.
While
Now
you're
it's
doing
helpful.
that, other
Oh,
than
here it is.
other than the ordinances, are there other ways that we can engage homeowners in tree protection?
Yeah, so again, I'm like definitely still learning all of this, but I think it's just about being open and transparent, um, trying to involve people in the decision-making process, trying to be like available. I think one of the kind of silver linings of COVID, for example, is that it's forced us to be more like virtual and have these like virtual options for like town halls and things like that. So I think like keeping all avenues open for community members um, to kind of see what's going on in these, in these meetings, like the town hall meetings and like councils and like when decisions are being made, allowing like ample time for people to comment on them. I know it kind of slows down the process a bit, but it's good to get people involved because, of course, it's their community. But then, of course, there's always like a certain types of people that are going to be more involved. Usually, it is more of like the retiree groups. But so I think what's important is maybe finding ways to engage with people that are otherwise not thinking about these types of things, like, or aren't aware that they have a say. So I think that will be our biggest kind of like next steps is like, how do we engage with these people that aren't the kind of typical people that are involved in the decision-making process, even when they do have the option. So I'm gonna share. Oh, I don't usually use the GoToWebinar. So is there a way I can like share to everyone just the name of this paper?
Yeah, so if you go
Or
into
maybe
the
you can.
chat, and then it'll say at the very bottom two, and then you can specify
Yeah.
the message to all entire audience.
Oh, okay. I think I can only do organizers, so maybe you can share
Yeah,
it.
I can reshare it.
I'm gonna send it to you. But yeah, it's the COSER 2021 municipal response to state legislation. And then it's specifically about Florida, and it came out in 2021. So it had been a while since I really like read that. Because I think it came out in the beginning of last year. So, but I think there was worry about like, what does this mean for other states? Will they kind of see what Florida's doing and try to kind of copy what they're doing but there's I was gonna say there's just a lot of issues going on in the States, so but yeah.
Well, we've hit our time for today. So if there's no other questions, I'll wrap it up there, and we haven't had any submitted in the past few minutes. So I want to thank everyone for joining
Yeah.
us today, and thanks to Kaitlyn for presenting. Before we bid adieu for the day, I do, as always, want to invite you to consider donating to the Canadian Tree Fund to help continue funding arboriculture research and education in Canada. Our grants just came out a month ago. We just chose the recipients, and then into January and February, we'll be selecting undergraduate students for scholarships to pursue their arboriculture, urban forestry interests in Canadian universities. If you're interested in donating, I've just forwarded the link in the chat to all the audience members there. And for donations of $20 or more, you're issued a tax receipt. So consider making a donation either on behalf of yourself or on behalf of your company. Have a tax receipt. Get your write off, and you'll be able to donate to a worthy organization in Canada that's promoting our industry. As Bridget's saying to me now as well, the CEUs are automatically going to be admitted to the ISA if you're in attendance and are an ISA certified arborist and put your contact information in the chat there when you signed up. So with that, I'd like to give a big thank you to everyone for tuning in. Big thank you to Kaitlyn for coming out to present, and as always to ISAO for running the webinar series for the Canadian Tree Fund. If you have any follow-up questions that happen after the presentation, you're welcome to email the Canadian Tree Fund, and we'll put you in touch with Kaitlyn or help answer your question as we can. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Thanks, Kaitlyn, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.